Naomi Osaka, 4 Grand Slam titles, 15 months gone from the WTA Tour, and a return that looked familiar but in reality almost had to start from zero. On January 1, 2024 in Brisbane, she stepped onto the court amid the calls of the crowd. The cameras immediately found her. The serve was still powerful. The shots still carried the sound that once made the entire tour wary. On paper, Naomi Osaka was back, but behind that moment was a far harsher truth. Ranking no longer protected her the way it used to. Match rhythm had disappeared. Her body had gone more than a year without enduring the pressure of consecutive matches. Life no longer revolved entirely around tennis. At home now there was shy, and every practice session, flight, or recovery day had to coexist with a responsibility Naomi had never had before. While she was away, the WTA Tour kept moving. Other opponents played, improved, accumulated ranking points, and grew sharper. Naomi returned to a world that had not stood still waiting for her, and most frightening of all, she herself did not yet know where she truly stood. Training could show that the power was still there, but it could not recreate 5-5 in a deciding set, when the legs grew heavy and one small error could change the entire match. Then Brisbane brought a hope that almost deceived everyone. Naomi won her first match. The serve was still sharp. The ball striking was still beautiful. There were moments she looked as if she had never left, but one win only proved she could win one match. It did not prove she could play 2 hours, recover, and do it again the next day. It did not prove the timing would hold when fatigue appeared. It did not prove she could win 5 matches in a week, or endure 2 weeks of a Grand Slam. The return was something everyone could see. The near-total reconstruction was almost invisible. Coming back took 1 day. Becoming dangerous again would take almost 2 years. And Naomi was about to discover that the thing that returned fastest was also the thing most likely to make people misunderstand her comeback. The shots. I'll mention this just once. I've gathered these unforgettable sports stories, trivia, and memories into a book called The Golden Age of Sports Trivia for Seniors. If it sounds like something you'd enjoy, the link is in the comments. The painful part of a return is not forgetting how to play the sport that once took you to the top of the world, but realizing the body no longer automatically does the things you never used to have to think about. After roughly 15 months away from the WTA Tour, the period in which Naomi was pregnant, gave birth to Shy, and gradually returned to training had created a gap that a few months on the practice court could not simply erase. She still knew how to serve, still knew how to produce a forehand winner, still saw the open space on the other side of the net before most others even noticed it. But what does a former world #1 truly lose after 15 months without competing? The answer lies in details that are almost invisible. First is the match-specific endurance. A hard practice session is not the same as 2 hours under the pressure of a scoreboard, adrenaline, and constant changes of direction, then waking up with aching legs and having to prepare to do it all again. A Grand Slam is even harsher. The body must endure, recover, and repeat that cycle through multiple rounds. Then there is timing. Hitting the ball perfectly when the body is still fresh is one thing. Doing it at 4-4 in a deciding set, when the breathing is heavier, the legs slower, and the opponent has started reading your patterns, is something else entirely. Being just a fraction of a second late to the ball can turn a winner into an error. Movement is the same. Elite tennis does not only demand running fast, it demands the first step in the right direction, the ability to stop the body, change direction, recover position, and prepare for the next ball almost by instinct. Naomi once performed thousands of those movements without thinking. Now they had to be turned back into reflexes, and perhaps the hardest thing to rebuild is belief under pressure. The practice court cannot create a breakpoint. There is no crowd holding its breath. There is no scoreboard reminding you that a single error can take the entire set. Before, Naomi could structure most of her days around training, treatment, sleep, and recovery. Now tennis had to coexist with a wider life in which Shy also needed time and her mother's presence. That does not make motherhood an obstacle. It only makes the structure of a professional athlete more complex. And this is the thing outsiders find hardest to see. A comeback is not simply reclaiming your best shots, it is rebuilding the conditions for those shots to still exist when the legs are tired, the pressure rises, and the match starts turning against you. Naomi's weapons returned fairly quickly. The much harder part was making them reliable again. There were days in 2024 when Naomi Osaka looked exactly like the player the whole world once feared. The serve bounced off the court with the familiar speed. The return came early and deep. The forehand left the strings with a weight that left opponents only able to turn and watch the ball. Watching just a few highlight clips, people could easily believe everything was back. But that is the trap of a comeback. A few brilliant points can hide the truth that a champion is not judged by the ability to reach the peak for 10 minutes, but by the ability to live near that peak throughout an entire tournament. The match against Iga Świątek at Roland Garros 2024 was the clearest example. On a clay court that had never defined Naomi's success, she could still play at a level high enough to push one of the most dominant players in the world to the edge of defeat. The serve worked. The ground strokes pierced through the court. The attacks forced Iga to retreat deep. In certain moments, Naomi did not look like someone searching for a way back. She looked like a true contender. But playing that well created a more painful question. If that level still existed, why did the results of the whole season not match it? The answer lies in the difference between ability and the ability to repeat. A comeback player can play one set at a top 10 level. A contender must hold a high enough level through 2 hours of play, through a third set, through a recovery day, through the next opponent, through a different surface, then do it all over again. Hitting a perfect forehand is technique. Believing in that forehand after missing 2 in a row at 5-5 is competition. A strong serve when the body is still fresh is one thing. Keeping the second serve reliable enough when the legs are heavy and the pressure rises is something else. Technical comeback can arrive fairly quickly. Power, contact point, stroke mechanics, feel for the ball. Competitive comeback is much slower, closing sets, escaping breakpoints, recovering after errors, still daring to attack after just failing, and trusting your patterns when the scoreboard starts choking every choice. For Naomi, that difference was even more uncomfortable because she did not need anyone to explain to her what a good shot looked like. She had her own memory. She knew the feeling when a return landed in the right place, knew the feeling when the feet arrived at the ball at the right time, knew how a ball was supposed to leave the racket with that kind of weight. And by Cincinnati, the gap between that memory and the present became clear enough that Naomi publicly said she did not entirely feel like she was in her own body. There were balls she believed she should not have missed. There were shots that left the racket lighter than she remembered. To outsiders, those were just a few errors in a tennis match. To a former number one, every error was a reminder that the mind still remembered the perfect version of that movement, while the body could not always execute it. This is a kind of frustration a beginner does not have. A new player only knows herself today. Naomi knew how strong she once was, and because of that, every time the old level flickered and then disappeared, the distance between potential and result became more uncomfortable. The US Open 2024 only made that feeling clearer. Naomi knew she was faster, stronger, and understood the comeback better than at the start of the year. But the Grand Slam result still ended early. The pain was not that she had lost her talent. On the contrary, the talent appeared often enough to prove it was still there. The problem was that she could not yet hold it steady long enough for a tournament to have to change around her. She could still touch the old ceiling. What she could not yet do was live there. And while Naomi could feel every small detail gradually getting better, tennis was improving. But the rankings told a far harsher story. The rankings only know what you have done recently. Naomi Osaka was once world number one. But after a long absence, the old points gradually disappeared, and the name that once stood at the top began sliding to positions that no longer offered the same protection. A protected ranking can help a player get into certain tournaments, but it cannot turn Naomi back into a top seed just because the whole world still remembers how good she once was. And that is when the comeback starts to become ruthless in a way very few spectators see. A low ranking means she can face a strong opponent in the first or second round. Not being seeded means there is no buffer to find rhythm before having to face players who are in their best form. An early loss is not just a defeat. It can take away an entire week of competitive repetition. In sports like the NBA, a star returning from injury still knows that a few days later there will be another game. He can play poorly today, watch the video, adjust, and try again. Tennis does not give Naomi that guarantee. If she loses in the first round, the tournament is over. She leaves the city, returns to training, and waits for the next opportunity. That creates an almost ruthless loop. A low ranking leads to a harder draw. A harder draw makes it more difficult to string together consecutive wins. Fewer matches mean less match rhythm. Less rhythm makes earning points slower. And the ranking continues to climb bit by bit, instead of bouncing back simply because Naomi was once a champion. The career record remembers who Naomi used to be. The draw only knows where she stands now. That is not humiliation. No one has taken away what she has done. This is simply the professional consequence of having disappeared from the tour long enough. But it is that coldness that makes every week of the comeback more exhausting. Naomi does not only have to beat the person on the other side of the net, she also has to reclaim a position in the system that can make the following weeks less harsh. Every win therefore carries two meanings. It puts her into the next round, but at the same time it buys a small opportunity for the future. More points, more chance of a better draw, more chance of not having to face a contender too early. In 2024, that process happened slowly but truly. Naomi gradually returned to the top 100, then moved into the top 60 and top 50 range. From the outside, that was an extraordinary step forward for someone who had fallen very deep in the rankings while not competing. But at the level of players who want to contend for Grand Slams, the top 60 is still not a safe zone. A bad draw can still stop momentum after just one afternoon. A good week can be erased by a difficult matchup the following week. And that is what makes the climb not look like a straight upward path. There were months when Naomi felt she was playing clearly better, but the ranking only inched forward little by little. There were matches where she beat a strong opponent only for the next reward to be another strong opponent. A great past cannot shorten that path. She had to reclaim every position with current points. Then, when she stepped into the beginning of 2025, for the first time progress began to take a clearer shape. In Auckland, Naomi did not just win one match and stop. She won enough to reach her first WTA final in nearly 3 years. A year earlier, she still had to fight to collect individual matches. Now she was only one match away from a title. In the final against Clara Towson, Naomi won the first set 6-4. After many months of trying to make the numbers move, finally there was a number that seemed to be on her side. One more set. One set to turn the entire process of climbing the rankings, enduring hard draws, and collecting every win into a real trophy. But then another problem appeared, colder than the rankings themselves. Naomi had spent many months making the numbers change. In Auckland, she was finally only one set away from a title, and then her body ended the conversation. The most ruthless thing about an injury during a comeback is not only that it takes away a match, but that it can destroy what an athlete has spent many months building: continuity. Naomi Osaka walked into the Auckland final in 2025 after a week in which, for the first time in a very long while, everything began to connect. The wins no longer appeared in isolation. She had gone through multiple rounds, had more time under pressure, more opportunities to close difficult sets, more evidence that the quiet work behind the scenes was finally turning into results. Against Clara Towson, Naomi won the first set 6-4. A first title after many years suddenly stood only one set away. But the value of that trophy was greater than the trophy itself. It could bring ranking points, confidence, a better position for the following tournaments, and most importantly, the feeling that momentum had finally sided with her. Then the abdominal issue appeared. Naomi could not continue. The final ended with her having to retire. The damage was larger than one unfinished match, because a comeback exists through continuity, and continuity had just been cut. An injury appearing exactly when momentum is forming can overturn an entire plan. Training blocks have to change. The repetitions that were supposed to keep accumulating have to stop. Recovery is no longer preparation for the next match but becomes a process of determining how much the body can handle. A schedule built weeks in advance has to be reconsidered, and after a long period of learning to trust her movement, an athlete begins to wonder whether the next acceleration, the next turn, or the next change of direction will bring the problem back. For Naomi, the timing was even more brutal because the Australian Open was right ahead. She still went to Melbourne and still tried to compete. The early wins created enough hope to believe the problem could be managed. This is what makes a comeback always emotionally dangerous. A few good days can make people believe the hard stretch is over. But then the abdominal issue appeared again. In the third-round match, Naomi once more could not finish the contest. Within just a few weeks, the same area of the body had intervened twice exactly when her tennis was starting to create momentum. This is not a story about an athlete who has lost the ability to play tennis. The reality is almost the opposite. Naomi's level was improving faster than her ability to maintain continuous presence on the tour, and in a comeback, availability is sometimes nearly as important as ability. You cannot build match rhythm if you constantly have to stop. You cannot accumulate ranking points if the good weeks are cut short. You cannot turn confidence into habit if every time you start trusting the body, the schedule is interrupted again. Her earlier career had taught Naomi a hard lesson. The desire to continue is not always enough to overcome every limit. In 2025, that lesson appeared in a different form. She wanted to compete. Tennis was getting better. But desire cannot heal a part of the body that is not yet ready to carry the load. Therefore, the problem was no longer simply how to make Naomi hit the ball better. She needed to find a way to create more matches without constantly having to start over. The big draws remained harsh. An early loss could take away an entire week of competition. An injury could take many more weeks. And reputation could not buy what she needed most. Not a bigger stadium. Not a more famous opponent. Not a brighter spotlight. Naomi needed competitive repetitions, stepping onto the court, enduring pressure, winning or losing, recovering, then coming back and doing it all again. That very need led her to a choice that might look strange for a former world number one, St. Malo. A WTA 125 tournament, smaller than the stages once attached to the name Naomi Osaka, on clay that had never defined her career. Less prestige, fewer lights, but it had what Naomi needed more than anything at that moment: matches. The next turning point of the comeback would not come from choosing a bigger tournament. It would begin when Naomi accepted a smaller stage. There are times in a comeback when the most important step forward takes the shape of a step back. In May 2025, Naomi Osaka went to St. Malo to play a WTA 125 event, a stage far smaller than the places once attached to her name. She had been world number one, had won 4 Grand Slams, had grown used to stadiums where every serve was watched by tens of thousands. But St. Malo was not a place for that image. Smaller prize money, less spotlight. Clay had also never been the surface that defined Naomi's strength. Looking only from the outside, this decision was easy to interpret as evidence that she had gone down. But Naomi did not go there to protect the image of a superstar. She went because her comeback was missing something reputation cannot buy: consecutive matches. After months in which an early loss could end an entire week of competition, after injuries that kept cutting momentum, Naomi needed more than a good practice session. She needed to step onto the court with a scoreboard, feel the nerves, have to maintain aggression when trailing, have to close a set when the body was already tired, then wake up the next day and do it all again. At this exact point, the story of Andre Agassi becomes a useful mental model. Agassi was once world number one, and then accepted going down to play smaller challenger events to rebuild his career through competition, rather than only through practice. Naomi was not copying that path, but the logic behind it was very similar. Sometimes the ego has to yield to the practical needs of an athlete trying to rebuild what was lost. St. Malo therefore became a laboratory. Every match answered a different question. Could Naomi keep attacking after just missing a shot? Could she keep the first serve stable enough when pressure rose? Could she change patterns when the opponent started reading her forehand? More importantly, could she win today and still be ready enough to step onto the court tomorrow? One of the matches at the tournament showed that this trophy did not come easily. There were moments when Naomi was pushed into a position of having to chase, had to endure games where the rhythm was imperfect, had to pull herself out of moments that could easily make a comeback player lose belief. And those moments were the ones that carried real value. Practice can help fix technique. Only competition teaches again the feeling of having to find a way to win when the tennis is not pretty. Through each round, Naomi kept staying. Not one outstanding performance and then a reset. Not one beautiful upset and then starting over again the next week. This time it was win, then another match. In the final, Naomi defeated Kaja Juvan and lifted the trophy. It was not the biggest title she had ever won. Perhaps it was one of the most useful, because what Naomi truly carried away from St. Malo was not only the trophy or the ranking points. She carried the feeling of momentum, something very hard to describe, but that every elite athlete recognizes when it appears. The body began to grow used to competing continuously. The mind began to grow used to closing difficult matches. Confidence no longer came only from good training, but from concrete evidence that she could step into the next day and keep winning. And most importantly, St. Malo did not become an isolated moment. In Rome right afterward, Naomi continued to win, extended the good streak, and proved that the confidence could transfer from one tournament to another. This was exactly what 2024 had lacked. Back then, a very good match was often followed by a reset. In 2025, a new pattern began to appear. Wins created more matches, matches created more rhythm, rhythm created more confidence, then confidence made the next win more possible. By the North American hardcourt season, a bigger test appeared. Montreal was no longer a WTA 125. The field was stronger, the stakes higher, the pressure thicker, and Naomi went deep again, this time to a WTA 1000 final. St. Malo had answered that she could string together multiple wins. Montreal asked a harder question. Could that momentum survive when the level of the opponents rose? The answer was again yes, and when the results improved, ranking began to change its role. What had once pulled her into harsh draws gradually became an advantage. A better position, more favorable entry, more opportunities to build the next run. Naomi was no longer only trying to survive the comeback. She began to create a system that fed itself. But everything St. Malo and Montreal proved still lacked one final test. A Grand Slam does not only demand a high level, it demands that level exist through many days, many opponents, and many layers of pressure beyond any ordinary tournament. St. Malo proved Naomi could build momentum. Montreal proved that momentum could survive a stronger field. New York would decide whether it could survive a Grand Slam. 7 years earlier, New York had introduced Naomi Osaka to the world. But in 2025, she returned there with a completely different need. Not memory, but present evidence. Montreal had given Naomi what she had lacked most through much of 2024, a long enough streak of matches for confidence no longer to have to rest on feeling. She had won many consecutive matches, reached a WTA 1000 final, improved her ranking, and entered the US Open in a position completely different from the early months of the comeback. But a Grand Slam is always a more ruthless test. There it is not enough to have one good day. The body has to withstand multiple rounds, recovery has to be fast enough, timing has to return after the tired days, confidence has to survive each tense set, and most importantly, a player has to prove that her level does not only appear in one moment, but can be repeated against stronger and stronger opponents. That is why the match against Coco Gauff carried meaning larger than an ordinary win. For the American audience, Gauff was not a name from the past. She was a standard of the present, one of the top players that any contender had to prepare carefully for when facing. Naomi walked into that match without needing any old footage to remind people how dangerous she once was. She proved it herself right on the court. The serve was sharp enough, the return early enough, the ground strokes heavy enough to force Gauff constantly to play from a passive position. Naomi won convincingly, and with that result, the way the story about her began to change. It was no longer only a former champion trying to come back. She became a player opponents had to prepare for right now. But an upset, no matter how large, was still not what Naomi had been missing for nearly 2 years. What she needed was to prove she could wake up the next day, carry the fatigue of the previous matches, do the warm-up, treatment and routine again, then step onto the court and continue competing with the same level of focus. The quarter-final was therefore important not only because of the opponent or the result. It was evidence of tournament durability. Naomi was no longer living on one explosive moment. She was living inside a tournament. Each round that passed took another portion of energy, but she still had enough to return, adjust, and continue. This was exactly the ability Brisbane could not answer, Cincinnati could not answer, and the beautiful highlights of 2024 also could not answer. Could Naomi hold the level through many days? New York finally began to say yes. When she reached her first Grand Slam semi-final since 2021, nearly 2 years of rebuilding suddenly took on a concrete shape. The hours of practice no one saw, the weeks of ranking climbing slowly, the times of having to start over after an early loss. Auckland cut short, St. Malo, Rome, Montreal, all of it now led to a stage where Naomi no longer needed to be called a comeback story to attract attention. But the US Open did not give her a perfect ending. In the semi-final against Amanda Anisimova, Naomi fought through 3 sets and lost. A year earlier, a defeat like that could have made the entire progress feel as if it had just disappeared. In 2024, Naomi had struggled with the feeling that she was improving, but the scoreboard refused to confirm it. New York 2025 was different in one very important point. The defeat was no longer powerful enough to erase what had happened before it. Naomi could be disappointed at not reaching the final, but she did not need to pretend the tournament had no meaning just because it ended with a loss. That reaction itself showed a different kind of progress, not healing in a simple sense, not that she had found herself again, but that a defeat was now only a piece of data, no longer holding the power to negate the entire body of evidence that the reconstruction had worked. Ranking also began to tell the same story. For nearly 2 years, the number next to Naomi's name was often slower than what she felt she was building. She played better before the ranking was high enough to protect her. She won the big matches before the system truly returned a favorable position. But after Montreal and New York, that gap began to narrow. The deep runs brought points. Points improved ranking. Better ranking created more favorable opportunities to build further runs. What had once been a drag began to become part of the momentum. St. Malo proved Naomi could still win a tournament. Montreal proved she could hold the level when the field grew stronger. New York proved she could carry that level through multiple rounds of a Grand Slam, through pressure, recovery, and accumulation that nearly 2 years earlier neither body nor ranking had given her the chance to do. And that was when the old question began to become meaningless. Can Naomi Osaka come back? Was no longer the right question. She had done it in the only way that matters in elite sport, through present results. The new question was much harder. How high can this version still climb? And 2026 would make that question even more complicated, because Naomi began to prove she could still go higher at the exact moment she also became clearer about something else. She was no longer willing to pay every price just to climb higher. Not every comeback ends with reclaiming what was lost, and Naomi Osaka stepped into 2026 with a more uncomfortable truth than that. She had proven she could still return to the peak of competition, but that did not mean the body or life would allow her to pursue everything at the same cost as before. The Australian Open 2026 delivered that reminder very early. An abdominal issue again forced Naomi to stop, as if the body wanted to remind her that the success of 2025 had not made her invulnerable. The rebuild had returned rhythm, ranking, confidence, and the ability to compete with the best players, but it had not erased limits. And right here, Naomi's second career began to pose a question that the first chapter of her career had not forced her to face in the same way. To become the best version possible, how much of her life was she still willing to let tennis take? Elite tennis does not only demand talent, it demands continuous travel, long training blocks, recovery days calculated by the hour, weeks away from home, small adjustments so obsessive that almost the entire living schedule has to revolve around how to get the body another percentage point. That is how great careers are usually built. But Naomi now had a different boundary. She still wanted titles, still wanted to win the big matches, still wanted to know where her ceiling still was. If she no longer had the hunger, there would be no conflict at all. Precisely because the hunger still existed, the new choice became more painful. Not whether she had enough desire to sacrifice, but whether every sacrifice was still worth paying. Naomi has spoken publicly about the tension between optimizing tennis and the time given to her daughter. That does not make her less professional. On the contrary, it forces her to become a harder kind of professional, one who is no longer allowed to assume that everything outside tennis can be pushed aside. And the remarkable thing is that while that boundary became clearer, her level continued to expand. Roland Garros 2026 brought a deeper run on a surface that had never defined Naomi's greatest achievements. The meaning was not only in the number of rounds, it showed that her game was becoming broader, no longer living only on the things that once made her dangerous on hard courts. Then in Bad Homburg, Naomi reached the final on grass, further evidence that this second career was not only about recovering what she had done well before, but also about learning to exist in places that had never been her strongest. And then Wimbledon delivered the clearest competitive evidence. On the other side of the net was Aryna Sabalenka, the world number one, not a symbol of the past, not a name used to trigger nostalgia, but the current standard of the tour. Naomi won. She reached the Wimbledon quarterfinals. That moment mattered not because it proved Naomi Osaka was back in a simple fairy tale sense. It mattered because it changed the nature of the question. If a player can beat the world number one while no longer building her entire life around optimizing tennis at any cost, then where does the ceiling of the second career truly lie? This is where the way of looking at Naomi's professionalism needs to be honored differently than before. She had accepted playing a smaller event when she needed match repetitions, accepted that ranking had to be rebuilt match by match instead of being handed back by the past, accepted that injury needed to be managed rather than turned into a test of courage, accepted that progress does not follow a straight line, and most importantly, accepted that optimizing career was no longer the only goal with the right to decide every choice. Naomi's first career was largely built by trying to take from tennis everything she could achieve. The second career may depend on her deciding exactly how much tennis is allowed to take back from her life. That is a small change in wording, but a very large one in reality. Greatness used to be measured by how much an athlete was willing to sacrifice. Naomi's greatness now may be measured by the ability to know what is worth sacrificing and what is no longer allowed to be traded away. Therefore, a fifth Grand Slam does not need to become the final judgment on this comeback. She may win another slam. Ranking may continue to rise. The second career may last longer or shorter than anyone predicts. But 2025 and 2026 have already provided enough evidence that the question is no longer whether Naomi has enough talent to threaten the best players. She has proven that. The question now is how much she is willing to pay to keep chasing the rest of that ceiling. Naomi Osaka spent nearly 2 years proving that 15 months away did not erase the player she could still become. She rebuilt the matches, the ranking, the rhythm, and the ability to threaten the strongest players in the world. But the second career now demands a question that the first career rarely forced her to answer. Not how much she can give to tennis, but how much she is still willing to let tennis take from her life. The answer to that question, rather than the memory of the person she once was, may decide how far this comeback ultimately goes. If you believe that greatness lies not only in titles, but also in the way a person rebuilds herself after life changes everything, subscribe to the channel to continue following stories like Naomi Osaka's. Thank you for watching until the end, and see you in the next video with another journey about resilience, loss, and the real price behind the spotlight.